Morning, Dr. Walford. Yesterday, when we were looking at the special meeting of reference centre directors on the 13th of May, I think we explored the fact that the Galbraith letter and recommendation hadn't been circulated to those directors. Can I then just ask you about its circulation more widely? It would appear from the documentation and evidence that the inquiry has that Dr. Galbraith's recommendation and report never reached ministers. First question, whose decision would it have been as to whether to provide that to ministers or not, both in terms of division and hierarchy?
Well, I'm not clear whether actually somebody would have taken the view that ministers needed to see that document until it had been discussed in the Committee on Safety of Medicines Biological Subcommittee, because basically ministers would obviously have wanted to see what the experts were going to be saying about it. It would have been for MedIMCD to make sure that the paper went to Medicines Division. Now, this thought had occurred to me as well when I was going through the papers, and I didn't see in any of the correspondence from Mary Sabellas, which reached me, that the paper had been copied when Dr. Galbraith sent it to anyone in Medicines Division. So I don't know if Medicines Division was aware, but I would certainly say that that would have been the place that it should have gone, and that obviously after discussion in the CSMB, ministers should have been told what the outcome was. I haven't found any papers which suggest that they were.
And that I think is certainly where our understanding is, Dr. Walford. Looking at it now, do you think that ministers should perhaps have been told what a leading public health doctor working within the public health laboratory service was saying to the department?
I think it would be perfectly reasonable to have told them, yes.
But actually, more than perfectly reasonable, the right thing to do to tell them?
I think it would have been difficult to tell them without some sort of forward advice, if you will. And basically, I don't think any of us was in a position, even had I been in charge of giving it to ministers, was in a position to comment on the paper fully before the experts had had a look at it.
And then just going back to the question of whose role it might have been to alert ministers, if you can just help us understand what the process might have been. So Medicines Division, you think, would have been the part of the department that would have been seized with thinking about that?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I think the MedIMCD, Dr. Field of MedIMCD, could well have decided that it would be a good thing to put it up. I guess one of the problems is that there's obviously a gap in the correspondence. I don't know about the discussions that Dr. Field purported to have with doctors, the ad hoc discussions. I just have this lacuna in the evidence, and I really can't help you very much more with that, I'm afraid.
Can I then ask you to look at ARCH 0002544? Now, this is a document from Dr. Peter Foster to Mr. Watt, dated the 15th of July 1983. There's no evidence to suggest that this is a document that would have crossed your desk
No, it didn't.
in 1983,
Right.
or indeed, I think, the department's desk at all. But I just wanted to draw your attention to it and then ask you about it. So we can see Dr. Foster is seeking to summarise key points concerning AIDS from the meetings that have taken place in Stockholm, so that's the World Federation of Haemophilia. Mm-hmm. He refers to information presented by Dr. Evett of CDC. Paragraph 1, we can see he refers to the total number of confirmed cases in the States being marginally higher than would be predicted from an exponential growth, said to be consistent with the view that AIDS is a transmissible agent. Point 2, epidemiology strongly suggests a transmissible agent, and he refers to transmission between spouses, etc. He then refers to there being epidemiological evidence of 3 stages to the disease, so essentially a long latency period. If we go further down the page, we can see then in paragraph 5, predicted mortality is 100% in 3 to 4 years for those with Kaposi's sarcoma and 100% in 25 months for those with opportunistic infections. Haemophiliacs are in the group which develops opportunistic infections. So a very bleak picture indeed in terms of mortality. Then he refers at paragraph 7 to confirmed cases of haemophiliacs, said to be 16 in the USA, half of whom are now dead. Then 5 in Europe, although it seems to refer to Canada as part of Europe, but in any event, 5 cases, and he refers to the 3 Spanish, the 1 Welsh. He refers to other delegates seeming to think that there may be more cases than this outside the US. Point 8 refers to, of the 16 cases in the States, 1 being a mild haemophilia B case, and that the haemophilia A cases encompass mild, moderate, and severe. And then if we go over the page, he refers to AIDS still being located mainly in key urban areas in the USA, but the haemophilia cases are generally located in non-AIDS areas. This is strong evidence for transmission by factor 8. Common lots of factor 8 concentrates seem to be rare or non-existent. And then he refers to the Welsh case, having received products from ARMA and Immuno as well as NHS, so that's paragraph 11. Other suspected European cases received products from Highland and Immuno. And then if we go to what he says after paragraph 12, he says this: my general impression was that there was a concentrated attempt from USA delegates to play down the situation. The risk to haemophiliacs was said a number of times to be 1 in 1,000,000, although simple arithmetic suggests 1 in 1,000. It was stressed that causes of death for USA haemophiliacs is, and then we can see the figures there set out, i.e. keep on taking concentrates. However, this data is for 1982. Data for 1983 could well be different. And then, if we look at the last paragraph, with the first haemophiliac case only 12 months ago and a possible incubation period from 1 to 3 years, a number of delegates, mainly European, were clearly uneasy and felt that we may still be only seeing the tip of the iceberg. And obviously, as things turned out, that was a correct feeling. First of all, would it have been helpful for information of this kind to have been shared with the department? Because this is an on-the-ground update from what's being said, perhaps in a more informal setting by CDC.
Yes, obviously.
Do you think if it had been made available to the department, it might have shaped or influenced your thinking to any different extent?
I honestly can't tell. Basically, it still remains the case that the situation is, as it were, unproven, but there's a strong epidemiological evidence that AIDS is transmissible. And I'm not sure, because we've just gone through this again quickly, what it was saying about factor 8 concentrates. Is there some sentence in there specifically?
Well, there are. I think there's. If we just go further up the page, sorry, I don't have my hard copy to hand.
Common lots of factor 8 concentrates seem to be rare or non-existent. Yes.
And it's the last sentence of paragraph 9, isn't it?
Yes, strong evidence for transmission by factor 8.
Right.
We'll come later in the course of the morning to the line that the department used, the line to take the no conclusive proof.
Indeed.
But this might, for example, have caused earlier than in fact happened a shift in that thinking.
And the date of this Stockholm conference that was reported here by Dr. Watt?
I can't remember the date off the top of my head without checking. His memo is the 15th of July 1983. I think the chair is going to be able to tell you momentarily what the exact date of the World Federation of Haemophilia conference was.
I'm just looking to see. I'm not sure I have it noted. It's June 83.
It's June.
The reason
30th of June.
The reason I was asking about the date is because, this was information which we didn't have, but there was information in an article in The Lancet, or at least an editorial in The Lancet, about April 1983. I've been provided with that by the inquiry, and I think I don't have the reference immediately to hand, but
I can find it for you if you'll give me
it's the words tip of the iceberg that reminded me that I've seen that Lancet article, which actually refers to the tip of the iceberg, but then goes on to cast a quite significant doubt on how certain matters were in relation to transmission.
It's PRSE 0002723. And it's the column on the right-hand side. And I think you might be referring, well, the last sentence of the first paragraph refers to, thank you, the T-cell population abnormalities commonly seen in haemophilia may be the submerged part of an iceberg,
Yes, that's
which
what
age is the clinically obvious tip. And then if we go to the last paragraph on that column, there's reference to Deforge in the middle paragraph, and then I think you may then be referring to the last 4 lines.
Yes.
The link suggested by the American workers must be regarded as not proven. Whilst careful surveillance must continue, the reported cases do not constitute a strong argument for a change in treatment policy.
Yes.
So that, our understanding is that that's an editorial written by Dr. Peter Jones, in fact.
I didn't know that.
I think that's what
There is, just if you scroll, remove the, that's it, thank you. And the actual phrase tip of the iceberg is used, isn't it, higher up? Yes.
The end of the first
it's
paragraph.
talking about, can we just get rid of the thank you? It's in the March issue of Annals of Internal Medicine. 3 articles describe further cases. An accompanying editorial by White and Lezane suggests that T-cell population abnormalities commonly seen in haemophilia may be the submerged part of an iceberg of which AIDS, they mention 7 cases altogether, is the clinically obvious tip. So that may be where that editorial mentions tip of the iceberg.
Thank you.
This is, I think, early April, so 2nd of April
2nd of April,
1983. It obviously predates any knowledge of the Bristol case, which we'll come on to later. It predates the World Federation of Haemophilia meeting that Dr. Peter Foster was talking about.
Right. That was the scan in Stockholm.
In Stockholm. So if we just go back to Dr. Foster's memo, ARCH 302544. If we go to the second page, 3 points I just wanted to emphasise from this. First of all, Dr. Peter Foster's assertion this is strong evidence for transmission by factor 8. Secondly, his impression that there's a concerted attempt by the American delegates to play down the situation. And then thirdly, his sense, the shared sense of some of the delegates that this is the tip of the iceberg. That, coupled with what is reported as being the very high mortality rate, and we see the mortality rates at that stage in the cases of haemophiliac patients, might that not have led the department to take a different view?
I can't say. I really can't say, but I wonder if I could actually draw your attention to a paper that the inquiry gave me last night, amongst the papers that I sometimes get at the end of a
Yes, I'm
day.
sorry about that.
And I have it here because I think this is a very interesting paper. It's July the 19th, 1983, so almost contemporaneous, if you will. And it's a paper from which was a meeting of the Blood Products Advisory Committee of the National Institutes of Health in America, a very prestigious organization.
So if we just pause there, I'm going to try and ascertain what the URL is, because I don't recognise it as something No. Oh, yes. I know what you're talking about, Dr. Walford. My apologies. So it's a document, in fact, I think the chair wants to ask you about BAYP 0004674.
And
Yeah.
I thought, and as I say, I read it for the first time last night, I thought that this was quite a comprehensive exchange of views between relevant experts in America. It didn't certainly convey to me the impression that there was some sort of concerted attempt to play down the potential dangers, if you will, more the amount of uncertainty that existed between all these experts. And I seem to recall in the summary, yes, I've highlighted it for myself,
Page 3,
paragraph 9.
the bottom of the page, showing it.
Would you care to read
Yes,
that
so
out?
it was very clear that confronted with this complex problem, the committee felt that a balance must be struck between theoretical risk of the product to recipients against the need for an uninterrupted supply of a life-sustaining therapy. As several members of the panel stressed, it would be undesirable to distribute and use a lot of product which incorporated plasma from a donor with a definite diagnosis of AIDS. However, signs and symptoms suggestive of AIDS, e.g. persistent lymphadenopathy, night sweats, etc., would not be persuasive enough to dictate a recall of product. Enough concern was expressed about the question of supply that the committee was unwilling to advise the agency to make an unalterable regulatory position calling for an automatic recall which would likely jeopardise product availability. Adding to the uncertainty with regard to the decision of whether to quarantine or recall a product lot, several committee members and other participants expressed the opinion that the risk of AIDS from transfusion of plasma derivatives or use of AHF concentrate has not been definitely established. They cited the fact that nearly all the haemophiliacs with AIDS had used material from different lots and that many other haemophiliacs receiving these same lots had not developed AIDS. They stressed the need for studies to follow up recipients of blood products derived from AIDS patients. The consensus of the committee was that the action to be taken for each incident of inclusion of plasma from a donor who might have AIDS into a product pool should be decided on a case-by-case basis.
So I merely recall this because I've read it so recently, and there is quite a dense discussion between the various participants. There's a participant from the National Haemophilia Federation. There are some fractionators. There is Dr. Bruce Evert of CDC, is a very influential character. And I think that this certainly doesn't suggest that there was a well-formed view that the personnel in America knew what they should be doing about it, and they had the degree of uncertainty that we ourselves were under at that time.
Well, certainly, as I read the paper, the issue there was whether or not there should be a requirement for any product made from plasma to which someone suspected of AIDS had contributed should be recalled. And it might be thought, mightn't it, that the earlier decision taken in March, when the FDA recommended to pharmaceutical companies that they did not distribute any product which had been made from plasma collected before the 24th of March in the USA, if the natural implication of that, I suppose, would be that any product made before the 24th of May should be recalled, one would have thought.
Any product made before that
24th of May.
March. Well,
because
one
it's
assumes that much of it would have actually been by then in patients rather than be available. I think the sort of gravamen of what they were wanting to say in relation to those new regulations was we have instructed the fractionators to do this far more testing sort of surveillance of their donors, making sure that their donors that belong to high-risk groups and so on are excluded, and so that they hoped that their product would thereby be safer after the 24th of March than it had been before then. But there wasn't a suggestion here that necessarily a particular batch might be withdrawn. I have found this really quite interesting because I don't know if I can refer to it. I did refer to the NIBSC reports of February 1984, where they were still considering whether a batch which was thought to have had donor in it who had either developed AIDS or had possibly developed AIDS should be withdrawn. I mean, it seemed to me absolutely axiomatic if you had the slightest suspicion that a product might have had in it a donor who had either developed AIDS or might well be suspected of having AIDS, that you would absolutely withdraw that batch wholesale. I think there could be I don't think there was a discussion about that. It was a bit surprising to see in America that they suggested that patients who had quite suggestive indicators that they might be incubating AIDS, if you like, they didn't think that was sufficient grounds for withdrawing a batch. I personally think that seems to be a mistake, but it's interesting that the matter was still being debated by NIBSC in 1984.
Well, the question which I was going to ask you, let me ask you it now, because we're talking about this document, was really the basis upon which, or part of the basis on which, the committee reached its conclusion, because this, of course, was reflected in the Congress decision, which you knew about. The Congress didn't go down the road of saying you've got to withdraw all product.
That's right.
Or you've got to ban. The reason for not automatically requiring recall, in part, may have been, perhaps, the contribution made at paragraph 6.
Bottom of page 2, please show it.
That's bottom of page 2. And there's a contribution from someone who represents the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association. And the summary of this, it's a bit dense in this text. We can look, please, Schumacher, at the start of the next page, top of the next page. Thank you. The point he was making in arguing against, as I understand it, against the idea that there should be a recall of product, was set out there. The best way, perhaps, to summarize it is to draw from the work of Mr. Justice Creever in his report on the Canadian blood product situation. What he said about this was in July 1983, Dr. Michael Riddell, the Vice President, Regulatory and Technical Affairs of the Armour Pharmaceutical Company, Armour, one of the 4 US fractionators, described the possibility of large-scale contamination at a meeting of the Blood Products Advisory Committee of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, a standing committee that advised the US Secretary of State for Health, the Assistant Secretary of Health, and the Commissioner of the FDA. Dr. Riddell said that on average, persons who were paid for their plasma had it collected 40 to 60 times per year. I think you mentioned this yesterday and made a slightly disparaging comment about that practice.
Absolutely.
He then estimated that at that rate, and given the pool sizes used in the United States, 4 infected persons could contaminate the entire world supply of factor VIII concentrate. I think this is the Americans thinking that they were the sole source of factor VIII in the world. That's the view that comes out there. But be that as it may, certainly they were the major commercial providers. And his conclusion was based on analysis that was confined to concentrates made from US plasma, but they were exported to many countries, including Canada. So it was really the implications of what he was saying, that if you are going to go down the road of saying, because someone's got AIDS, you've got to bin the batch which is formed from it, you would inevitably be binning a quarter of the production if you found one of these regular donors who suffered. That would follow. One way of looking at that mightn't it, that simply the pool sizes were so big that you couldn't let the system fail.
Well, undoubtedly the pool sizes were massive, and they were far bigger than the pool sizes in the UK.
But it's a stunning, maybe a stunning comment for him, a stunning argument for him to put forward, mightn't it? That essentially the pharmaceutical companies' methods of production have become so efficient in the commercial sense, they couldn't be allowed to fail, because they might be contaminated with something that could kill.
Well, that's absolutely true, sir. But on the other hand, if you think about a pool size of whatever size, one infected donor, which donor unknown to the manufacturers, unknown to themselves because they're incubating in an asymptomatic fashion, one infected donor in a pool of any size will contaminate the pool. And of course, in one blood transfusion can contaminate the pool. It's if you have an organism which you cannot detect, which is potentially in blood and plasma, then potentially it will contaminate whatever size pool you put it in.
So the task is really minimizing that risk, isn't it?
It is minimizing that risk and finding a way in which you can inactivate the virus if there is a virus.
Yes, thank you for that.
Dr. Walford, can I now ask you about something you say in your witness statement? It's paragraph 80.4, I think, so Shumic WITN 4461001. And it's page 182. Now, you were at this point in your witness statement talking about that note from Dr. Sweeney to Ms. Frankel that we discussed yesterday. I'm not asking you to go back to the note. But it's your understanding of what the consequences would be for those with haemophilia if there was a reversion to cryoprecipitate and reduced usage of factor VIII concentrates that I wanted to ask you about. You say this: my view, and that's the view about the value of the clotting concentrates far outweighing the possible transmission of AIDS. My view will have then been based on the fact that whilst the introduction of cryoprecipitate in the 1960s had been highly beneficial for severe haemophiliacs and significantly improved their life expectancy, they still suffered a life constrained by pain, disability, and the need for frequent hospital admissions, and in many cases, premature death. With the advent of factor VIII concentrates, both life expectancy and quality of life were greatly improved. And you also, I think, just for the sake of completeness, if we look at paragraph 86.34, page 198, and we look at the last sentence of that paragraph, and again, the context here is you expressing your views to Dr. Field about Dr. Galbraith's call for action on AIDS. You say here the lack of information, that's the lack of information about AIDS, needed to be set against the very well-known and severe harms that would be caused to haemophiliacs if American factor VIII concentrates were withdrawn or curtailed without any realistic replacements. So if we just go back to the paragraph 80.5 on page 182, you yourself hadn't been involved as a clinician in haemophilia care, other than that period of time you told us about when you were a senior house officer earlier in the 70s. Mm-hmm. So your view about the impact of concentrates or not having concentrates as opposed to cryoprecipitate on patients would not have been based upon your own clinical experience?
My limited experience, which was not actually to be the person who was treating the patients, but I did see patients quite a lot simply because I was going there with the thawed cryo and helping maybe to put up the drip, for example. But basically I didn't actually treat the patients, but clearly some of the patients were wheelchair bound, some of the patients were obviously had obvious manifestations, if you will, of having had bleeds. Now, of course, I don't know firsthand, but I had read quite extensively about haemophilia, and I would suggest that what I'm describing there is probably realistic. Certainly, it was so much more difficult if a patient was receiving cryo and couldn't rapidly get to a hospital. The bleed would be continuing, obviously. Damage would be being done, damage which was sometimes irreversible. Certainly the major cause of death in patients with haemophilia at the time we're writing about was bleeding, and usually a cerebral bleed, but not exclusively. Could be a bleed into the gastrointestinal tract or other organs. So I don't think what I'm describing is incorrect, but of course I would stand to be corrected by people who treat haemophilia if they were to say, well, this is actually overblown. I would not myself think it was.
Paragraph 80.4, my apologies. What you appear to be saying was that even with cryoprecipitate, there would be many cases of premature death. What was the factual basis for that understanding?
Well, I think basically before cryoprecipitate, the life expectancy for haemophiliacs was, I think the median was about 37 years. Before cryoprecipitate, I think that was about 1964. Judith Poole produced cryoprecipitate or showed the method for producing cryoprecipitate. After that, obviously there were clear improvements, but the main cause of death remained, and everything that I've read suggests that this is true, that the main cause of death in premature death in haemophiliacs was bleeding.
The vast majority of haemophiliacs receiving treatment with factor VIII concentrates on a day-to-day basis, and I'm just talking for the moment about severe haemophiliacs, but
yes,
of course there are haemophiliacs, mild
yes.
and moderate haemophilia. As far as the evidence the inquiries had would seem to establish, they're receiving treatment for largely because of their joints,
Yes.
An ankle bleed, elbow problems, and the like. Now, that's not life-threatening. It can, if untreated, of course, have significant adverse consequences for the patients. But it might be said that what's being painted here in paragraph 80.4 is a picture that if you remove cryoprecipitate, if you remove factor VIII concentrates and use cryoprecipitate, even for 6 months, a year, 18 months, 2 years, for a temporary period, there's going to be multiple cases of disability and death. Was that not an overstatement?
You've just mentioned potentially removing factor VIII concentrate for a period of, I don't know, 6 months, or I don't think 6 months would obviously not going to do the trick here, but maybe 2 years. That's removing concentrate. The problem was that we didn't have enough cryoprecipitate. If there had been copious supplies of cryoprecipitate readily available, then you would have reverted to the status quo ante before concentrates came into manufacture. And that would have not been ideal for patients with haemophilia, but it would have obviously been better than if there had been a very clear view that everybody was going to get AIDS if you didn't do that. I mean, that would have been a quite clear and dichotomous decision, and you could see what the way forward was. But there wasn't anything like enough cryoprecipitate, and it could not have been made quickly. It would have had to restart over time. You then have the problem of making sure that you got enough cryoprecipitate supernatant to BPL to make the factor 9 that patients with haemophilia B needed, so that they didn't suffer as a result of what you'd done in relation to haemophilia A patients. So my sort of question would be, how could some 40 million international units of factor 8 be rapidly replaced by cryo? Now, you said to me yesterday, and I think it's a very valid point, you wouldn't necessarily replace it all. You would stop home treatment, you'd stop prophylaxis, you'd stop elective surgery. I have to say that if one had, I think, if the Haemophilia Society at the time had been told that that was what was going to happen, there would have been huge concern and complaints from patients that their entire lives were going to be turned upside down. And that was on the basis of the fact that by May, we had one patient who had developed AIDS in the UK. And it is the case, and we'll possibly come to it later, I hope we do, that I see that the CMO letter, which was ultimately written in 1985, refers to the fact that there have been 3 cases in the UK, 3 cases of AIDS in haemophiliacs. So you would have made a massive transfer of, as it were, risk of bleeds and so on, however severe. And actually, one ought not to minimize the awful bleeding into joints. Really painful, really sometimes irreversible. And if you can't then do surgery because you haven't got the concentrate to do the surgery, I feel I shouldn't, in a sense, be advocating for patients with haemophilia. They can speak absolutely for themselves. And if it's felt that I am exaggerating the problems that they might have experienced from a sudden massive shortage of factor 8 in one form or another, then I obviously stand corrected. I just don't think I am exaggerating, and it's interesting that the Committee on Safety of Medicines, when it came to look at in the biological subcommittee, was referring to these factor 8 as being life preserving, if you will. I forget the exact words they used. So it was an awful conundrum to be faced with, and I don't think there was any particular right answer. But to suppose that you could absolutely rely on cryo to replace the needed amount, not the desired amount or the demand, it wasn't feasible at that time.
We'll come on to the Committee on the Safety of Medicine subcommittee meeting later in the course of the morning, but it's right, isn't it, that none of either the measures that I mentioned yesterday, and you've summarised a number of them, neither those nor what would need to be done, what could be done within RTCs, was ever actively explored at the time by the department?
At the time, to revert to cryo?
Yes.
Well, it was actively explored, not within regional transfusion centres, but Dr. Gunson, who was the chair of the regional transfusion centre directors, said it was not feasible. Dr. Lane said he could not produce small pool cryoprecipitate freeze-dried. I wrote a paper for the CBLA specifically asking whether we could do something about that, whether we could, the BPL could produce small pool products to replace the larger pool intermediate concentrates. And the answer was he couldn't do it on logistic grounds. So it was not thought of. It just seemed totally impractical and impossible.
In terms of what Dr. Lane was saying about BPL's ability, you've referred to that in your statement, and you've accurately summarised it. I'm not proposing to go to it. What is the material that you're relying on? And if you can't find it now, by all means, come back after one of the breaks and let me know what it is, because I'm not trying to put you on the spot. But when you're talking about Dr. Gunson, as it were, representing the position of RTCs, what particular interactions or reports or views of his do you have in mind?
Well, the one that I can certainly immediately recall to mind now is that he wrote to the chief medical officer, because he was the consultant advisor, and he had heard that there was going to be a meeting of all the relevant consultant advisors. There was only one in blood transfusion, and that was him. That there was going to be a meeting, and he thought that all these consultant advisors needed to be aware of the problem which had arisen, and he'd just come back from the Council of Europe meeting, I think, at that time, and where he had pointed out that it was obvious that Council of Europe was beginning to talk about moving to cryoprecipitate. This is what they were thinking was a good thing to do. He also pointed out that that was actually the main product used in quite a number of countries, and he talked about the downsides of some of those products. But nevertheless, he pointed out that it looked as if there was going to be a push towards using cryoprecipitate. He didn't think that that was something that could be done at the moment. He didn't think that that was going to be practical, and he wrote accordingly to the CMO. So that was a reliance on Dr. Gunson there, who would have taken the temperature, if you will, of regional transfusion directors.
We may come. I know the document you're referring to. I haven't got the reference to hand, but it's in here somewhere.
It's in here.
We may come back to that in that case, perhaps after the break. Can I then just come on to the issue to which the chair was alluding when we looked at the Riddell observations? The concern about the dumping
Yes.
of pre-March 1983 plasma in the UK.
Yes.
And so if we just pick it up, first of all, at DHSC 00012004. So this is one of the communications from the states, the Department of Health and Human Services, Public Health Service, Food and Drug Administration, 24th of March 1983. And it sets out, I won't go through the detail of it, but it sets out the steps that were advised should be taken by all establishments collecting blood for transfusion or for use in plasma pools. Do you recall whether this document or a summary of it came to your attention at this stage in March of 1983?
No, it didn't. And what I have seen from looking at the papers is that Dr. Joe Smith, of the director of NIBSC, sent it through to Medicines Division, I think to Dr. Fowler, and I was not aware of this in detail of this paper. Of course, I knew that regulations had been introduced. I can't remember exactly when I learned, I think in April, something like that. But I didn't see the detail. I subsequently, when I had been shown the detail, reported that in one of my briefings and spelt out what the details were.
If we then go to an exchange of correspondence you had on the subject with Professor Bloom, it's HCDO 603_122. And we can see this is now in May of 1983. It's following the meeting of reference centre directors on the 13th of May. And he says, there's one outstanding point I do not think was finally closed. This refers to the possibility that some of the American factor VIII manufacturers may consider it advantageous to export products which were made from plasma collected before March the 24th, rather than retain them for domestic use. And then he refers to the FDA guidelines and says, I have some misgivings concerning the possibility that stocks held by manufacturers and source plasma collected before that date will be preferentially exported. While I do not wish to overstate the risk from imported American factor VIII concentrates, nevertheless, I think that haemophilia centre directors would wish to be reassured that factor VIII concentrates imported are at least up to the standards recommended for use in the USA. And I'm glad to learn that you intend to take this up with Medicines Division. I hope it will be possible rapidly to vary the product licence for relevant imported products to take account of these recent developments. So Professor Bloom has sufficiently concerned to write in these terms. If we look at your reply, DHSC 301206, it's 16th of May. You've obviously had a telephone conversation with Professor Bloom, and then you say, I've today both spoken to and minuted Dr. Keith Fowler of Medicines Division to draw his attention to the possible need to institute new labelling requirements for factor VIII concentrates derived from plasma taken before the new FDA regulations came into force. I've also asked him whether for products currently available in the UK, it would be possible to find out the period in which the donors were bled and whereabouts in the USA the donor centres supplying each manufacturer are situated. I've asked if we'll treat this as a matter of the utmost priority. Now, we'll come on to your exchange of minutes with Dr. Fowler. Did you understand Professor Bloom to be advocating actually some form of ban, stop order, whatever the mechanism might be, on pre-March products? Because what your response appears to be about the possibility of addressing the concern in a rather less radical way by labelling.
Well, of course, we wouldn't have known about when the plasma was taken from the donors without labelling, without being able to identify. It meant that sort of a priori, we needed to know how we could identify such material. So the first thing was, I mean, I totally agreed with Professor Bloom that we might be faced with a dumping situation. So obviously wanted to avoid that. But how do you avoid that if you don't know when the plasma was taken? And we didn't know, as it turned out. We didn't have any way of identifying the date on which the plasma was taken for the product. Obviously, you knew the date that the product was actually manufactured, but not when the plasma was withdrawn from the donors. So my first concern was, well, you know, a diagnostic, if you like. How would we know when the plasma was taken? And he then came back to me, and I'm sure you'll probably take me to this, to say that actually we don't know when it was taken, but we could make it a condition.
And so if we go then to your communications with Dr. Fowler, DHSC 301394, this is the 16th of May of 1983. We spoke, and then you refer to the FDA new requirements. And then you say this, 4 lines down. However, the UK product licences do not contain this requirement. That's the labelling requirement. And there are fears among haemophilia centre directors that the more dangerous material may be dumped in the UK. You may like to consider whether there's a need to make a similar labelling requirement for material imported into the UK. In relation to the whole issue of the transmission of AIDS in blood products, several questions have been put to me. And then you raise 4 matters. Is it possible to obtain concentrates made from plasma which doesn't come from the centres with the highest numbers of AIDS cases? 2, is it possible to accept only concentrates made from plasma taken after the 24th of March regulations were published? If so, would sufficient finished product be immediately available? 3, can we find out for each manufacturer the date of plasma collection in relation to each batch of concentrate in current use in the UK? And then 4 was whether Immuno or other European manufacturers could produce sufficient material derived from European plasma. And you say that these matters have been raised with you essentially by both Professor Bloom as chair of the Haemophilia Centre Directors and the director of CDSC to be investigated as a matter of the utmost priority. If we look at, first of all, a comment from Dr. Oliver, DHSC 302227_052. So he circulates your minute more widely, says the questions you've posed are clearly of considerable importance and of wide implications for the Licensing Authority Supply Division and, of course, for HS. It seems to me important that our activities are fully coordinated so that we safeguard our own supply position and, if possible, obtain factor VIII from the safest available sources. Ideally, I suppose we would like to see any imported factor VIII which is derived from American material to be manufactured after the 24th of March. and then there's a suggestion of a meeting. And then he says, whatever we do, we must not take any precipitate action which might affect the supply of necessary factor 8. And then, so that we see the full exchange of correspondence, we get to Dr. Fowler's replies at DHSC 0002229_006. This is the first of 2 minutes from Dr. Fowler, dated the 23rd of May. In the first paragraph, he says, manufacturers are certainly able to identify batches of plasma collected after the 24th of May. So manufacturers should be able to identify pre and post 24th of March. Sorry, I think I said May. Yeah. Plasma. Whether or not they be prepared to release this information is another matter. Then he talks about the stop order procedure, which requires manufacturers to submit protocols and samples from every batch they propose to sell in the UK to Dr. Duncan Thomas's department at NIBSC. The content of an individual manufacturer's protocol is very much a matter for agreement between Dr. Thomas and the company. I do not think that the date of plasma collection is a requirement at present, but I see no reason why it should not become so if it were thought desirable. The licensing authority would then, on the advice of Dr. Thomas, be able to reject those batches which did not comply. The practical and legal aspects of this suggestion would, of course, have to be checked beforehand, but even the threat of such action might be sufficient to persuade the manufacturers to comply voluntarily. So is this right, and this is what you understood from Dr. Fowler's first minute? He's essentially saying there is potentially a way of dealing with this. The US manufacturers can identify the difference, as it were, and there is a mechanism, the stop order mechanism, which could be introduced by the licensing authority.
That's right.
And then if we go to the second page, we see his second minute. In his second paragraph, he says, your suggestion that US manufacturers, sorry, can we go slightly up the page, may try to dump pre-24th of March 1983 material on the UK market has to be taken seriously. And then he refers to the stop order process and says if that's a non-runner, then we'll be wholly dependent on the manufacturers. And then he answers your other questions. Point one, he doesn't know whether it would be possible to obtain concentrates made from plasma which doesn't come from the highest risk areas. He doesn't know the position about adequacy of post-24th of March 1983 supplies. That's paragraph 2. But he does say, essentially, there probably is an issue in relation to there being pre-March 1983 concentrates effectively already in the UK awaiting clearance by NIBSC. And then he doesn't think that the European option is a runner, essentially. No. Now, I'll look in a moment with you at the 3rd of June 1983 interdepartmental meeting. But broadly speaking, as far as you're aware, was any particular action taken in relation to pre-24th of March concentrates?
Well, I sent another minute, which I hope somebody can lay their hands on, to Dr. Fowler asking even more questions to be put to manufacturers.
Yes.
And so there was a list of long questions that I thought that they should be asked. And of course, the question that I was also asking, and again, I can't remember if it was in the same minute or another minute, was tell me about the stocks. What have we got? What is available? Could we have material only made from post 23rd of March plasma, as it were, made in conformity with the regulations of 23rd of March? And he then describes the stocks in one of the minutes to me, where there is substantial stock of material made beforehand, but no suggestion that there is any stock of post 23rd March regulation. That's hardly surprising when you consider, the length of time it was taking to make a batch of product. But essentially, within the country, there was some tens of millions of international units of factor 8 made from before those regulations came into force. Though I should actually caveat that by saying a number of the manufacturers, and in fact, Sir, Ms. Richards, you gave me a paper last night from Alpha Therapeutics, who had introduced their own and actually possibly even, if not more stringent, as stringent controls on their donor selection before the March 23rd FDA regulation came into force. So there was some material within the stocks in the UK that was potentially usable, if you like, if you only wanted to use material that was made in conformity or approximately in conformity with the March 23rd regulation. And we did get a list of that. I mean, Medicines Division provided me with a list of the material that was available. So you had the stocks where actually the plasma had been obviously just taken before the regulations came in, and then the manufacturers who had introduced their own and quite stringent requirements before the March 23rd regulations. So we had that information, and there was some material which could be used if all you were concerned about was that it needed to have been after the March 23rd regulations came in. But the question, I suppose, and this is again something the Committee on Medicines dealt with, at least not at length, but a little, was how effective the March 23rd regulations were likely to be, because they did rely quite considerably on a degree of donor honesty in terms of their health. They relied also on some kind of actual physical examination by personnel in the plasmapheresis centres, which sounded interesting, but kind of, how realistic was it? So I think the question was how much difference it was likely to make to the safety of any factor VIII. And obviously, any improvement is better than no improvement, but it was not necessarily going to be, well, if we simply take the post 23rd of March regulation material, that material is likely to be substantially safer than material taken beforehand. I don't think you could conclude that, but obviously it would have been good to have been able to use that material in preference. But this wasn't a question of we're stopping all American factor VIII. It's just you wanted, if you were going to get American factor VIII, it needed to have been in conformity with the FDA regulations.
I mean, you're rightly explaining that there were a number of considerations, and absolutely there's further exchanges of minutes, and we'll look at some of them, I think. But my question is ultimately, was anything done, whether by NIBSC in terms of labelling or by providing information about what batches were known to have been produced in conformity with the manufacturer's own internally imposed standards, sharing that information to haemophilia centre directors so that they could say, well, I'm not going to use those, but I will use those. Was anything actually done in the end?
Yes, I looked. I looked at all the papers that I was provided with, and I couldn't see that. One of the things that I saw was in the June the 3rd meeting of officials, there was a Miss Spencer from Medicines Division, and there was a question asked about the issue of could we stop this material made from before the March 23rd regulations. And she seemed to think that legally it was going to be difficult.
We'll come to that in just a moment. But is this right then, that as far as you know from your own knowledge and from the documentation that you've seen, there's nothing to suggest that ultimately any steps were taken in relation to limiting or providing information or imposing requirements on pre-March 1983 plasma?
I haven't seen that, but obviously if you are going to speak to anyone from NIBSC, they may be able to provide much more information. Yes,
and indeed it may be that Dr. Thomas may be able to assist in that regard. Let's come then to the 3rd of June meeting. So if we start with the agenda, which is DHSC 0002353_038. So on the 1st of June, is it a Dr. Green? Or
No.
Mr. Green?
No.
Ms. Green?
Mr.
Mr. Green circulates an agenda and papers for the meeting. And if we go to the next page, we can see what the agenda was for that meeting. To consider whether there's any further action the National Blood Transfusion Service or Haemophilia Reference Centres can take, and whether any further assistance or complementary action by the department is appropriate. To consider what action could be taken by Medicines Division and Supply Division to minimise risks in the light of the new FDA requirements. To consider what action is appropriate with regard to the implications of the introduction of heat-treated factor VIII concentrates. To consider what should be done to encourage research into AIDS. Just go further down. To consider the implications for NBTS of the line taken by the Council of Europe. To consider the implications for CBLA, so that's the Central Blood Laboratories Authority, and the plans for the redevelopment of BPL. 7 is to consider what actions needed by DHSS in respect of homosexual rights groups. And 8, what further action should be taken with the Haemophilia Society. So there's the agenda. Now, there were a number of papers prepared for this meeting, I think most of which were prepared by you.
Yes.
So if we just look and see what those are, they are at DHSC 0002229_019 to start. So we've got paper 1, which is a background paper. I'm not going to ask you to go through the detail of it, but we can see bottom of the page. We've got the question, is it transmitted in blood or blood products? As yet, there is no conclusive proof that AIDS is transmitted by blood as well as homosexual contact, but the evidence is suggestive that this is likely to be the case. Then you refer to the cases in the States and in Spain, and the transfusion cases,
Yes.
which no doubt includes implicitly a reference to the San Francisco baby case.
Yes.
And then over the page, we can see the second heading is AIDS and haemophiliacs in the UK. You say there's one suspect case in Cardiff. Although CDSE states that this case meets the USA criteria for AIDS, the clinician in charge does not consider that it should be regarded as a confirmed case. Just pausing there, you must presumably have got that from Professor Bloom.
I don't know about getting it from Professor Bloom, but he seemed to consistently say that this may be a case that he had in Cardiff, but although CDSC very clearly stated that it was a case according to the criteria that they used, and I was in no doubt whatsoever that it was a case, I simply maintained that the clinician in charge didn't consider it should be regarded as a confirmed case. That was the fact of the matter.
And you presumably were not aware that Professor Bloom had described it as a probable case in his notification to CDSC?
No.
Does it?
I didn't know he'd notified CDSC, actually.
Does it cause you concern thinking about it now that he was, it seems on a number of occasions, essentially, arguably, might be said, underplaying whether this was a true case of AIDS?
It seems to be the case that he was very reluctant to actually confirm that he agreed it was a case.
And we can see now there's reference to a possible case in Bristol, so you've become aware of that. So that's paper 1. Paper 2, which is the next page. Action already taken by relevant authorities outside the department. I'm not going to go through the detail of it, but we can just see you identify the leaflet proposal by regional transfusion directors, and we'll look at that later. at paragraph 1. Paragraph 2, you refer to the Haemophilia Reference Centre Director's recommendation. Again, I'm going to come back to that in a little while. 3, you refer to the FDA regulations. Over the page. 4, you refer to the Council of Europe and its draft recommendations. And again, I'm going to come back to that. So that's paper 2. Paper 3 is the next page, just so that we can see what material was before the meeting. So this is looking specifically at the dumping issue. And you pose a number of questions, such as that at paragraph 2 on that page. Should we accept only post 24th of March products? Would there be adequate supplies? You refer to the possibility of using stop orders and labelling and so on. So you pose essentially the same questions or similar questions to those you posed to Dr. Fowler.
Yes.
Paper 4, which is the next page, I think we can simply note it's looking at the possibility of heat-treated factor VIII concentrates. I'm not going to ask you about the detail. Paper 5, I won't trouble you with. You didn't write, I think, paper 5, and it was concerned with research in any event.
Right.
And then paper 6 is at DHSC 302229_020. Now, this was about the implication of aids for production of factor VIII at BPL. You refer to point 4, the more cryo a region produces, the less plasma it can send to BPL. You talk about the advantages of cryoprecipitate in paragraph 5. And then if we go down to paragraph 7, you talk about disadvantages to cryoprecipitate, convenience, possible allergic reactions, etc. And then over the page, at paragraph 9, you say haemophilia centre directors in the UK are not advocating a change in the pattern of treatment of haemophiliacs, which would require increased production of cryoprecipitates. And that presumably is a reflection of the 13th of May reference centre directors meeting.
Assuming so, yes.
And then paragraph 10, if there were to be a significantly increased demand for cryoprecipitate, this would pose major operational and financial problems for RTCs and would reduce significantly or even totally the amount of plasma sent to BPL. And that's based, is it, essentially on your understanding from Dr. Gunson? That would be the problem.
Dr. Gunson and Dr. Lane, I think, both together.
Yes, sorry. In relation to BPL, absolutely,
Yes.
Dr. Lane. In relation to RTCs, Dr. Gunson's essentially your source of information.
Yes, although there were various meetings of regional transfusion directors, and I can't tell whether or not they came, before all this or not. But Dr. Gunson was a very good source of information, which I believe he fully reflected the views of his fellow transfusion directors in most cases.
And then you explain in paragraph 11 that the preceding paragraph describes a worst case situation, so effectively an all or nothing situation. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, the demand for cryoprecipitate could well increase to a certain extent, and we need to know what contingency plans the CBLA has or is in the process of developing. And so those are the papers. And then if we can just then look at the minutes.
Well, just before you do that, can we go back up the page? Thank you. It's paragraph 9. I'm just a little puzzled by the last sentence there. Referring to what the haemophilia centre directors were deciding, it suggests that the decision could well change if a haemophiliac who had received only BPL concentrate were found to have developed AIDS. So I can understand that might make them reluctant to use BPL concentrate, but why not, or did the logic apply to commercial concentrate?
Basically, I suppose that the thinking would be that if a BPL concentrate was found to have transmitted AIDS, then there was AIDS in the UK donor blood population. That would mean that obviously large pooled products such as concentrate would be capable of transmitting if a single donor was infected. At that point, a reversion to cryoprecipitate, which, if you could do it, where you're really only using a far smaller number of donations, you may be using 20 or 30 bags of cryoprecipitate at a time, but nevertheless, it's much smaller than the pools that were being used in BPL to make intermediate concentrates. It might have been felt to be safer, but it wouldn't have been entirely safe. But clearly at the time, I think that I can't totally answer your question because it's absolutely fundamental to what does this sentence mean. At the minute, they were not satisfied, I suppose, that there was a significant risk to the haemophiliacs from American factor VIII. They needed to go on using American factor VIII. But the whole scene would have been transformed if there could have been proof, if you will, that a patient who'd only ever had UK factor VIII at that point in time had developed AIDS, because, I mean, it would have thrown us all into the most terrible confusion, because it would suggest that AIDS was in the UK blood supply. And at the time, that wasn't thought to be the case.
I follow that, but the reason for my asking the question is the first sentence is talking about whether to increase the use of cryoprecipitate or not. Now, at that time, there was roughly twice as much commercial concentrate being used as domestically produced concentrate, was there not?
About half and half, I think. No, you're right about concentrate, but we had about half and half in terms of cryo plus concentrate. You're right.
So the question might be thought, if commercial concentrate was shown to have produced AIDS, that might have implications for the continued use of commercial concentrate.
Absolutely.
And so I would understand the last sentence if it said this could well change if a haemophiliac who had received concentrate or commercial concentrate were found to have developed AIDS. Even more so if only BPL concentrate. But it's the collocation, two. That's why I'm asking.
It's another non sequitur here.
It is.
Presumably so, yes. Well, I accept that.
And I appreciate you're only reflecting what you've heard from what the doctors were saying. Were they really saying that, or were they saying if we actually have proof of a death from someone who has only ever had concentrate or had a lot of concentrate, commercial concentrate, that that would be what was necessary to change their practice?
I'm not sure I entirely follow that, but basically, I mean, one was looking at cases as opposed to deaths in this instance.
Yes, AIDS, I'm sorry.
And essentially, they were aware of the potential of the hazard from American factor VIII concentrates. There was no indication at this point in time that UK-derived concentrates actually could transmit AIDS. It would have been so fundamentally unsettling, if you like, to the situation that if it were shown that somebody who had only received UK concentrate had developed AIDS, it would have no doubt promoted an entire rethink of where we were. But I guess I like to think that even if it's not particularly well expressed here, and maybe it isn't a particular, doesn't follow on from the previous sentence, that I was reflecting what I had heard from others.
Yes. So what you had heard from others was in effect expressed in a non sequitur, but there we are.
I would like to think that it was others who expressed it as a non sequitur, not myself. Yes, thank you.
So I was going to move to then look, having very quickly skated through the papers, but I know Dr. Walford is familiar with them, to look at the minutes of the meeting for which the papers were prepared. But given the time, perhaps it might be better to do that after the break.
Yes, we'll take a break then until 11:45.
Thank you.
11:45.